Bist du meine Mama?
Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean-30 and today we're having a look at an iconic piece of military equipment. This is a GM.38, the standard gas mask used by the German armed forces throughout the Second World War. Even if you are only passingly familiar with World War II infantry equipment, you've probably noticed the corrugated metal cylinder slung across the lower back of German soldiers. This is one of those, so without further ado, let's have a closer look at this and let me show you some of the key design features. Now, I will get to the carrying canister in a moment, but for now, let's just stick with the mask itself. As one of the very first nations to develop and field chemical weapons, Imperial Germany was also ahead of other belligerents in gas mask design. Unlike the British, whose large and small box respirators used a separate filter canister connected to the mask by a hose, a configuration which did not change until the end of the Second World War, right from the beginning, the Germans adopted a compact design with a small integrated filter, the GM.15. The first Type 1, or Gummimaske, was made of rubberized canvas with round celluloid eyepieces and had a filter that screwed semi-permanently into the mask itself. This, however, was soon replaced by the Type 2 linen maske, which featured a 40mm DIN threaded connection for the filter. Amazingly, 110 years later, this remains the NATO STANAG standard connector for gas mask filters. And to learn more about Canadian and other Cold War CBRN equipment, please check out my many videos on the subject. Links in the description. The Type 3 linen maske introduced cheek pouches which allowed the wearer to reach in and defog the inside of the lenses, while the Type 4 Stoff maske featured head straps elasticated by steel springs and a folded-in rim to improve the face seal, another design feature that has survived to this day. All four models used a filter canister filled with activated charcoal soaked in potassium carbonate to neutralize chlorine and phosgene. Interestingly, unlike in later masks, there was no exhalation valve. The user either had to exhale through the filter itself or out through the sides of the mask. Early on, these masks were carried in a cloth satchel called a Segeltuchtasche with 3 compartments for the mask and 2 spare filter canisters. But later on, this was replaced with a cylindrical metal canister. The next model adopted by Imperial Germany was the GM.30 Ledermaske, which was made of tanned oil-sealed sheepskin due to a severe rubber shortage. It also featured a more sophisticated filter with 3 layers: activated charcoal soaked in potassium carbonate, pure activated charcoal, and diatomaceous earth soaked in potassium carbonate, hexamine for filtering phosgene, and piperazine for scrubbing CO2. Finally, the last World War I German gas mask was the GM.18, which, like the GM.17, was also made of leather. However, it featured glass rather than celluloid eyepieces, a proper exhalation valve, and a strap over the forehead to prevent the filter from sagging. After the First World War, however, the Reichswehr adopted the GM.24, which used a separate filter canister and corrugated connecting hose like the British small box respirator. But in 1930, this was replaced by another integrated filter mask, the GM.30. This mask was made of 2 layers of canvas coated in rubber, with a standard 5-point head harness and an extra neck strap made of ordinary canvas webbing but elasticated by steel springs. The circular eyepieces were made of celluloid set in threaded brass frames, allowing them to be easily replaced. These were also fitted with anti-fog inserts made of gelatin, which absorb humidity from the wearer's breath and stop the eyepieces from fogging up. There was a 40mm DIN threaded intake at the front for the filter canister, with a glimmer-style exhalation valve behind it. Now, the basic design of the GM.30 remained largely unchanged throughout the 1930s, with one major exception. The original valve housing pattern had the inhalation and exhalation valve at different angles. However, this was found to be too easily fouled, and soldiers tended to hit their teeth if they fell over while wearing the mask. This was thus replaced with a second pattern with the 2 valves mounted in parallel, and later with a third pattern where both housings were combined into a single casting. Now, the GM.30 was mainly manufactured by Auer and Dräger, and there were a number of specialized variants produced. For example, the Telefonmaske and Funkmaske, which had a threaded well on the cheek for inserting a microphone, allowing the wearer to use a telephone or radio. There's also a Luftwaffe variant for aircrew, which had a lateral connection for a corrugated hose that connected to the aircraft's oxygen system. Near the end of the war, these were also used experimentally aboard tanks fitted with a centralized air filtration system. Now, in civilian use, the GM.30 was known as the S-Maske, and it was completely identical to the military version, except for a stamp reading RL38/3. Indeed, these were not specifically manufactured for civilian use, but rather military units would once in a while turn in their existing masks for new ones, and the older ones would be refurbished and sold to the public for 12 Reichsmarks each. The government also issued purpose-built civilian gas masks, which you can learn all about in my previous video on the subject, link in the description. And finally, the GM.30 was manufactured in 3 basic sizes: Type 1 or large, Type 2 or medium, and Type 3 or small, with around 80% of those manufactured being medium size. Now, interestingly, these weren't based off of facial size, but rather facial proportions. For example, Type 1 was intended for soldiers whose foreheads were shorter than the distance between their eyebrows and their chin, while Type 2 was for the reverse, and Type 3 was for symmetrical faces. And as you can imagine, rubberized face pieces like these tend to distort when they're stored for long periods in the canisters, and so the GM.30 was issued with a special frame called a Maskenspanne to help maintain the mask's proper shape. Now, in 1938, the GM.30 was replaced by the appropriately named GM.38, which is what we have right here, though large numbers of the earlier masks remained in service throughout the rest of the Second World War. The main difference between the GM.30 and GM.38 was the facepiece, which in the latter was made of solid rubber rather than rubberized canvas. The design of the head harness and eyepieces was also slightly different. Otherwise, however, they are largely identical. Anyway, there are a number of different filter canisters that could be issued with both the GM.30 and the GM.38. These included Filtereinsatz or FE37, the pre-war model, FE41, the wartime model optimized for mass production, and the FE42, the late war model simplified for easier stamping. Now, gas masks are typically made with non-magnetic metal fittings so as not to interfere with marching compasses or other magnetic equipment, and indeed, early canisters for the GM.30 and GM.38 were stamped either AL for aluminum or NM for non-magnetic. However, as the war dragged on and Germany suffered increasing shortages of non-magnetic metals, they started issuing smaller numbers of non-magnetic masks to select personnel, while the rest were made of steel and stamped FE for iron and painted blue to set them apart. Moving on, we have the Tropen or TR tropical filter, whose internal components were more resistant to degradation in hot, humid climates. Rauch or R, a ring-shaped improved filter designed to reduce smoke infiltration. HN or J filter, filled with hexamine for use against hydrocyanic acid gas, aka prussic acid. This was widely used by SS troops in death camps when handling Zyklon B cyanide pellets. And finally, the U or Übungsfilter used for training. The second G38 I have here, kindly loaned to me by the Fort Garry Horse Museum, is fitted with a U filter also stamped FE37R or Rauch. Interestingly, with the filter removed, the GM.30 and GM.38 were used to protect soldiers against the backblast of early versions of the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, aka the Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launcher. However, later versions integrated a metal shield, making this practice unnecessary. And finally, we get to the most iconic part of this entire system, the carrying canister or Gasmaskenbüchse. This is fitted with a canvas sling designed to be worn horizontally across the small of the back, just above the bread bag. This particular example has an extra pouch attached to the sling for carrying a spare canister. The initial model of the canister issued in 1930 was 26 centimeters long and 12 centimeters in diameter. It had an all-metal lid closure and a middle suspension bracket. This was replaced in 1935 with a slightly shorter 25 centimeter version, which eliminated the center suspension bracket, integrated a short canvas strap on the lid closure to make it easier to open, and added an extra reinforcement ring, an aluminum stiffening liner, and a new design of spare eyepiece compartment. The third 1936 model added a spring-loaded closure system, which was even easier to open, while the fourth 1938 model was slightly longer at 27 centimeters to accommodate the GM.38 gas mask, and that is what we have here. Earlier versions were not watertight, but later versions were, with the waterproofing being indicated by a stamped letter D for dicht or tight at the bottom. Opening this up, there is a small compartment inside the lid for spare anti-dimming lens inserts. And you'll notice that this example is labeled with a name, Gefreiter or Lance Corporal Erich Hahn. Now, I have contacted the Bundesarchiv in Germany to see if I can track down any information on this individual, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, Erich Hahn is a very generic name, so it might take quite a bit of digging before I can find anything. But if I do come up with anything, I will make a follow-up video to report on my findings. Anyway, in the bottom of the canister would be stored a blister agent decontamination kit comprising a cleaning cloth and a bakelite container containing pellets of Lostantin, aka calcium hypochlorite or bleach. Soldiers were instructed to crush up these tablets and mix them with water either from their canteens or their spit in order to make a paste, which could then be rubbed over all gas-exposed areas. As you can imagine, this is a pretty cumbersome procedure to perform in the field, so later in the war, soldiers were issued with bottles of pre-mixed decontamination solution. However, Lostantin pellet kits continued to be issued until the end of the war. Finally, the GM.30 and GM.38 were issued with a rubberized gas cape to protect against blister agents like sulfur mustard and lewisite. This was stored in a canvas bag that was meant to be attached to the canister sling, but many soldiers found this cumbersome and instead wrapped the bag around the canister itself. While this practice was officially prohibited as it made the cape harder to access in an emergency, it was nonetheless widespread. Now, the same basic system was issued to all branches of the German armed forces, though often the canister was painted different colors depending on the theater of operations. For example, blue for Luftwaffe ground troops, or tan for troops deployed to tropical regions like the Afrika Korps. However, German paratroopers or Fallschirmjäger carried their gas masks in a soft cloth bag since the metal canister was too heavy and bulky to jump out of an aircraft with. Now, as an interesting aside, the Fort Garry Horse Museum also loaned me this item. This is the case for a CO-Anzeiger, a carbon monoxide detection kit that would have been carried aboard U-boats. Now, unfortunately, this particular canister is empty, but this would have contained a squeeze bulb and a rubber hose for collecting air samples, as well as glass tubes full of reagent for detecting carbon monoxide. As you can see, this case was clearly based on the GM.30 and GM.38 gas mask tube, and likely stamped using the same machinery, though it differs slightly in a number of details. And on the top of the lid, you can see the name of the manufacturer prominently stamped, Auer. Now, while mainly associated with Nazi Germany, the GM.30 and GM.38 were also used by a number of other nations both before, during, and after the Second World War. Francoist troops used the GM.30 during the Spanish Civil War. China, Turkey, Lithuania, and Greece adopted them just before the Second World War, while Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia captured German GM.30s and GM.38s or demanded them as reparations after the war. The Danish Navy and Civil Defense also adopted the GM.38 for several years after the war. Finally, in post-war Germany, the GM.30 and GM.38 were replaced in 1954 by the GM.54, which was a slightly simplified version of the previous two designs. This again was carried in a metal canister, though early on the Bundeswehr issued these with a canvas cover in order to distance themselves aesthetically from the Wehrmacht. And that, dear viewers, is a deep dive into the GM.30 and GM.38 gas masks, iconic pieces of infantry equipment from the Second World War. Thank you so much to the Fort Garry Horse Museum for lending me some of these items, and thank you so much to all of you for watching. I'll see you next time, another video where we'll look at yet more pieces of military equipment and other devices just like these. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.